Tonight's lecture concerns itself with Abiy and Rovah. Abiy and Rovah are different than any of the other pairs that we have had in our discussion of the great men of the Talmud. So we have many pairs, Hillel and Shammai, and Rav and Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Shmuel. We have many people that were colleagues that were at the same time, but there's no one like Abiy and Rovah. Abiy is mentioned over 1,177 times in the Talmud, and Rovah is mentioned even more times in the Talmud. And there is a tradition that in the Vilna Shas at least, that you could go no more than 3 pages in any tractate without finding the names of Abiy and Rovah that would appear. And the Talmud itself calls itself after Abiy and Rovah. It names itself Havayos, the Abiy of Rovah. The discussions, the debates, the occurrences of Abiy and Rovah. So Abiy and Rovah symbolize the Talmud, as no other 2 people who are recorded in the Talmud do so. And Abiy and Rovah are also different in the fact that they knew each other as children. They were lifelong friends. Everybody else that we meet met each other later. They grew up in different environments. They came from different places. They didn't know each other in their youth. They only knew each other when they reached maturity or when they began their careers as scholars. Abiy and Rovah went to Cheder together. They went to the same class together when they were small children. The Gemara tells us that they sat by Rabbi Bar Nachmani, who was Abiya's uncle. We'll discuss that in a moment. And they were 4 or 5 years old. And Rabbi said, "Where can you find God? Where is the HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Where can you see God?" And Abiy pointed to the roof, and Rovah went outside and pointed to the heavens. And Rabbi Bar Nachmani said, I guarantee that I have here 2 future great scholars in Israel, because of the fact that the Talmud tells us that you can tell how the tree will grow from its beginning trunk, just how it starts. You can tell how the gourd will be by cutting the stalk itself. So too, they in their youth already exhibited, in their very early youth, exhibited the fact that they would be great Torah scholars and that they would search for God. It's not accidental that Abiy said the roof and Rovah said he went outside and he pointed to heaven. Every partnership, so to speak, has an inside man and an outside man. All right, there's the person that runs the business on the inside and the person that the salesman works on the outside. We could say that Abiy is the inside man and Rovah is the outside man. We'll see that Rovah has much more to do with the community. Rovah has much more to do with non-Jews. Rovah has to do with the government. And Abiy is in the yeshiva, and that's where he is. The tune, the melody of learning Gemara is Omer Abiy. Abiy says, and so that the people should live. We're talking about Abiy is born in 267 of the Common Era, 277 of the Common Era. He dies in 337. So we're talking about being able to live 1,800 years, and if you walk into any yeshiva in the world today, Sephardi, Ashkenazi, Yemenite, Hesder, pre-army Mechina, you name it, you'll sit there for 5 minutes, you'll hear Omer Abiy. Abiy says, he's still saying. Omer Rovah is still saying. And there's nobody in the history of the Jewish people has so captured what Torah is as these 2 people. Even Bialik, who had left the yeshiva and really left traditional Jewry, but always had such a strong longing for it. He never found himself afterwards. That's one of the terrible things about leaving, is that afterwards one finds it very hard to find oneself. The Alter from Slobodka, Reb Nosson Tzvi Finkel, the head of the Slobodka yeshiva, said once, he said, listen, they come to Slobodka, I cannot guarantee that they'll be a scholar, I cannot even guarantee that they'll be a Shomer Shabbat, I cannot guarantee that they'll be religious. There's one thing I can guarantee, they won't enjoy this world anymore. And there's a great deal of truth in that. So Ravah and Abaye, Bialik's famous poem about the matmid, about the student scholar who stays up all night and studies, the refrain in the poem is, Omar Abaye, oi, Omar Ravah, oi, because that symbolizes it. That symbolizes the Talmud and all of its learning. Abaye is a strange name, not a Hebrew name at all. So what is the name? So there are two different opinions in the Rishonim. One opinion is Abaye was an orphan. His father died before he was born, and his mother died in childbirth. She gave birth to him. His father's name was Beilul. You know very little about him. Abaye was the only child that the parents had, and he was raised by his uncle, by Rabba Bar Nachmani. And Abaye in the Talmud is called Nachmani. So there are two opinions. One opinion is that his real name was Nachmani, and they called him Abaye because he was an orphan. Because the acrostic of Abaye, Aleph, Beis, Yud, Yud, is the acrostic of the verse, Asher Becho Yerucham Yatom. In you, God, does an orphan find consolation. And therefore, it was almost a tradition that when a child was, God forbid, an orphan from both parents, they called him Abaye. That's one opinion. The other opinion is that his real name was Abaye, but they called him Nachmani, after Rabba Bar Nachmani, who, after the grandfather, who he shared. And the reason they called him Nachmani, the Gemara says, the reason they called him Abaye, they say rather, is because Rabba didn't want to call him Nachmani because that was his father's name. And his father apparently was still alive. So he didn't want to call him by his father's name, so therefore he called him Abaye, and the name stuck, and that became the name that he was known for forever in the yeshivas. There's a third interpretation, already more scholarly for modern scholars. It doesn't have the geschmack of Asher B'cho Yerucham Yosom, but that Abaye is really a Syrian name, which means to be a comfort. And therefore that's why it's a Syriac form of the Hebrew name Nachmani. But in any event, that was Abaye's name. And he grows up in the house of Rabba, Rabba Bar Nachmani. Now, Rabba was a young man. Rabba was in his 20s when Abaye was born, but Rabba becomes one of his two main teachers. And Rabba takes him wherever he goes. And he was raised by Rabba's wife, by his aunt. And therefore in the Gemara we always find that he says, Omra li'aim, my mother told me. He doesn't mean his mother, he means the woman that raised him. And he always quotes her, especially in matters that have to do with practicality in life, with practical matters. So he always says, Omar Li'aim, my mother told me this, my mother told me that. And that's where I know it from. At the time when Abaye went to the yeshiva, the main yeshiva was already in Pumbedisa. We discussed last week Surah and Nahardoeh, the yeshivas of Rav and of Shmuel. Those yeshivas declined after the death of their great leaders, and the center of learning moved to Pumbedisa, which is a city on the Tigris River in Iraq. Now, in Pumbedisa, the Jewish community there was known for its business practices, was known for being, it was a very, I don't know how to put it, it was a luxury-minded, wealthy community. Business was more important to them than anything else. Therefore, the Rosh Yeshiva in Pumbedisa had very harsh things to say about their compatriots in town, because they felt that they did not respect Torah, and they did not really, as all heads of the yeshiva can testify, they did not really support the yeshiva as they should have. And therefore, they were very tough people against them. And Rabbah, who was the head of the yeshiva, he did not hide his feelings. He spoke to them often about the fact that their business practices were unethical, unacceptable. Well, people don't like to hear that, especially the next day you come and ask them for money for the yeshiva. And therefore, what happened was, there's a famous statement in the Gemara that Rabbah said that he was talking to Abaye. So he said that when the time comes to eulogize me, I should be eulogized very powerfully, so that people will weep. People will, and you should do a good job, because he said, I will be there. So Abaye is a very mischievous person. The Talmud tells us that he was a juggler. He could juggle 8 eggs in the air at one time. He used to do it on Chol HaMoed Sukkos and the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. He would juggle 8 eggs at one time. The Gemara doesn't tell us how many broke, but that he was famous for that. He was also famous for having quick remarks, a sharp sense of humor, to the extent that his Rabbeim were somewhat critical of him because of the fact that he was too lively. Yeah, but he said, Gilu biroda. He said, you don't have to worry about it. My rejoicing is always with fear of God. So the Rebbe said to him, how do you know that? He says, because I wear tefillin all the time. I always wear tefillin. If a person that always wears tefillin is aware of God over him, so my rejoicing is rejoicing within the confines of Torah and within the confines of Jewish life. It's not just being mischievous. But in any event, Abaye said to him, listen, he said, when you die, nobody in this town is going to cry for you. You're so tough on them. And not only that, he quotes him, the Gemara says that at the hesped of a person, you could tell whether the person's a ben olam haba. If people weep, if people feel that the person is being missed, so then the probability is that the person is a person who has achieved immortality. He said, when you go, man mircham alai, who's going to care? Nobody's going to know, you know. So he answered him, he said, if you and Rav Chonon, the other student, miss me, that's sufficient. I don't need that the town will miss me. If you'll miss me, that'll be sufficient. And Rabbah was his Rebbe. Abaye was a Kohen and Rabbah was a Kohen. They both they were descendants of the house of Eli HaKohen. Now there was a curse on the house of Eli HaKohen that they were not long-lived. They did not live long. So Rabbah dies, he's 40 years old. But Abaye lived to 60. So the Gemara asks, how come Abiy lived till 60 if Rab only lived till 40? The Gemara says because Abiy did great amount of gemilas chasodim. He did a great amount of charitable acts. Abiy supported 200 students in his yeshiva from his own pocket, even though he was a poor man. And therefore, the Talmud says that if a person is engaged in helping others, so then the genetic problem, so to speak, is modified. And that the person that can add years to one's life by gemilas chasodim, by doing good things on behalf of other people. So Abiy lived till 60. Abiy was the Rosh Yeshiva. We'll discuss that when he had a second Rebbe. The first one was Ravba in Pumbedisa. The second Rosh Yeshiva in Pumbedisa was Rav Yosef. Now Rav Yosef was a great Talmid Chacham who had a tremendous memory and who unfortunately became sightless in the midst of his career. Again, you read the Gemara, you see that everything happened to these people, but they're such remarkable people that almost nothing ever deflects them from their purpose. And because he was sightless, the Talmud describes that he always had to have people read in front of him. And Abiy and Rava both were his Talmidim. They both were his students. And they studied under him. At the end of his life, he not only became sightless, he started to lose his memory. So when he lost his memory, so he would say something and they would have to correct him because he would say the wrong thing. But the way they did it, Abiy always used to say, but Rebbe, you once taught us this and this. He didn't say, you forgot. He said, you once taught us this and this and this. And Rav Yosef would then remember, and he would say, yes, what I taught you is correct. But they never confronted him directly and said, and they never stopped him from delivering the lecture or saying the shir. They never said, well, it's over with. And so in that way, they certainly prolonged his life and gave him an opportunity to learn. When he died, when Rav Yosef died, so Rabbah died first, and then Rav Yosef died. So now the yeshiva in Pumbedisa was without a head. And there were 4 candidates for the position, including Rava. There were 4 people that were candidates for the position. And the question is, whom should they appoint? And they agreed that Abiy should be appointed because he was the greater scholar. It's interesting, he was the greater scholar, but the halacha is almost never like Abiy. We find this in the Talmud many times, that because a person was the greater scholar, doesn't necessarily mean that the halacha, that the law, or that the rabbis would follow his opinion. Because sometimes intellectual ability and scholarship and knowledge still don't hit the mark. And therefore, in all the disputes between Rav and Abiy and the hundreds of disputes between them that are mentioned in the Talmud, the halacha is like Abiy only in 6 places. Only in 6 cases, Yal Kagam, which is the siman, the acronym in the Talmud for the 6 cases where we follow Abaye's opinion. Otherwise, we always follow Rava's opinion, even though Abiy was recognized as being a greater intellect, and he was recognized as being Oker Horim, that he could, take mountains and move them and grind them together. His powers of reasoning were enormous, but nevertheless, the halacha wasn't like him. Also, the Talmud says that, and as happens many times, that a great scholar or a great genius many times it's hard for the students to relate to the person. It's hard for them to sit in his class. It's hard for them to hear the shir from him. And we find Rav Ada Barava says in a almost Really an amazing statement. He said, instead of chewing on bones by Abaye, why don't you come and eat meat by Rava? By that he meant that by Abaye you have to, it's like sucking the marrow bone. You got to suck it out. It's not clear. It's not easy to understand. And Rava sets the table for you, right? That's very easy to understand, and so you should come and learn by him. Nevertheless, Abaye was the Rosh Yeshiva in Pumbedisa for 14 years. And during his time, the yeshiva grew. Rava, who was not appointed the Rosh Yeshiva, Rava was born in a town called Machoza. Machoza is on the Euphrates. It was a Jewish town, but it was a town that was known for black marketeers. All of these people lived in a bad neighborhood. Thieves, etc. The Gemara says that the people of Machoza, they called them the people of Gehenna. That was the name that they gave. That was their popular name. And his father, Rav Yosef, Rava's father, Rav Yosef, had an established business. Abaye is poor, or he begins poor at least. So he begins both as an orphan and later on in life as a poor person. He doesn't have any wealth or backing behind him. So the Gemara says that he would learn all day and that he would work at his fields during the night. He was a sharecropper, and that he had to divide his day that way in order to be able to survive. Later in life, Abaye became more successful. He went into the wine business. Rava also sold wine. He also eventually was able to have fields that belonged to him, and that he himself had workers that worked the fields. But during the entire 14 years that he's the Rosh Yeshiva in Pumbedisa, he is without salary, naturally, from the yeshiva. That never was a paying job, even though he devoted his life to it in all practicality. Abaye is married twice. His first wife died. Again, he had tragedy. His first wife died very shortly after they were married. They never had children together. His second wife, however, was a very beautiful woman. A woman that was known for her beauty, and she was much younger than he was. And they had a number of children together. We know of two sons of his that are mentioned in the Talmud, Rav Bibi bar Abaye and Rav Shimi bar Abaye. And we know that he had a daughter. The Talmud tells us a story about his daughter. And it seems that he may have had another daughter as well. But she was an extremely beautiful woman. And she was such a beautiful woman that when Abaye died, and she was much younger, so she was available again. So the wives of the rabbis ran her out of town, because one of them said to her, this, because Abaye was her second husband also, they said to her, "You killed two already, we're not going to let you try for a third one." The Gemara puts it that strongly. But Abaye had children and grandchildren and has descendants, Kohanim, a family of priests. And he eventually, as I mentioned, was able to make a living for himself, and not only make a living for himself. So he said Rav Yosef, his predecessor in the yeshiva, supported 1,200 students, because he was a man of wealth. The Rosh Yeshiva was expected to provide the stipend for the students. That was how the yeshivas worked, and what they did, and that's how they worked in Europe also until yeshivas changed and began supplying meals or dormitories. But for instance, in Volozhin, in the yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva gave everyone a stipend. 3 ruble a week, 5 ruble a week, whatever. And then the student was expected to rent his own room which they did from the Jews in the town. So it became like a university town that lived off the yeshiva. And the yeshiva also, the student was also expected to have meals, many times prepared in the house where he rented the room, or there were women that would cook meals, and the young men would come to eat there as well. Those that were wealthy, those that came from wealthy families, so the yeshiva gave them no stipend. They were expected to support themselves. See, that was the same system that was in Iraq and Babylonia 1,000 years earlier. More than 1,000 years earlier. That was the system. In our time, the system has changed. In our time, it's reversed, that the student has to pay the yeshiva, and that the yeshiva is supposed to provide meals and rooms, though there are yeshivas here, Brisk and a few other yeshivas that still have the old system, that they provide nothing, and that they do give stipends, and to those who don't need the stipend, then they don't give. My father, he should live and be well, told me that in 1929 yet, in Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan in New York, Dr. Revel, who was mentioned in an article about me this week, so he would give stipends to the boys that he felt needed it. And he would give it out of his own personal pocket, because Revel came from a wealthy family. He was married into a wealthy family, an oil family from Oklahoma. And so he would continue this tradition of supporting scholars in the yeshiva by giving them money, and then they would be able to rent rooms, and they would be able to buy food and live. So that was the system in Pumbedisa in the year 250. And Abiy supported 200, and the previous Rosh Yeshiva had supported 1,200. So Abiy said, you know, these young men have the poor fortune of having a poor Rosh Yeshiva who cannot afford more. But previously we could afford to support 1,200, now we can only support 200. Abiy said ruefully, a famous statement in the Talmud, Bosar Anya Azla Aniyusa. After poor people, poverty follows them. So in that he meant a few things. First of all, a person who was once poor, so to a certain extent always remains poor even when he has money. You can't get out of the mindset of poverty. And he also meant that the poor people are shlamazels, that whatever they do, you know, the mazel doesn't always turn out for them. And therefore, Bosar Anya, after poor people, Azal Anyusa, the poverty follows in their wake, always brings them there. Both Abiy and Rava also were sick most of their lives. It was a common sickness. I don't know whether it was brought on by parasites in the area or something, but we find that most of these great people suffered from a form of colitis, a form of intestinal disease. And therefore, the Talmud tells us that Rava was cured by an Arab woman that gave him a potion made out of dates. But they were people who suffered their entire lives with illness. But again, it's not reflected in their personalities, nor is it reflected in their words in the Talmud, even though the Talmud describes it for us in a certain fashion. So Rava, after Abiy became the head in Pumbedisa, Rava goes back to his old hometown of Mechoza. And in Mechoza, as I mentioned, is not a very hospitable place for Talmidei Chachomim, for a yeshiva. Nevertheless, he founds a yeshiva, and his yeshiva becomes immensely successful, because Rava has an outgoing personality. Even though Rava is a very sharp person, the Talmud tells us that many times Rava said something to somebody and then he had to come and apologize. Rava is he doesn't mince words, but his yeshiva becomes very successful. Now, Rava is a wealthy man. His father was wealthy. inherited money. There was a ger in town who died, and since the ger, the convert, had no heirs, so all the money he left he gave to Rovah. So the Gemara says it was 12,000 gold coins, which at that time was a fortune of money. Rovah was in the wine business. Rovah also ran a ferry service across the Euphrates River, and Rovah also had ships that transported goods up and down the two main rivers of Iraq. And so he was a very wealthy man. Since he was a wealthy man, so he could afford a big yeshiva. And therefore, to a certain extent, we can understand why his yeshiva was popular, because of the fact that you were very well supported when you came to the yeshiva. Rovah had the wealth, and he expanded it on the yeshiva. Since he was a wealthy man, he also had contacts. He had contacts in the non-Jewish world, and he especially had contacts in the government. And the Talmud tells us that there was a queen, Talmud calls her a queen with that district, that she was most impressed by Rovah. And she said, he's a holy man, he's a wonderful man. And her husband said, I mean, what are you so enamored of this Jew? So she said, well, in heaven they do whatever he says. So he said, I don't believe it. So she came to Rovah and she said, listen, I'm in trouble because I said, you know, that you're a miracle man and that in heaven they listen to what you do. And my husband, who's the king, says he doesn't believe it. And if he gets angry and disproves, you know, he could kill me, he could kill you, all sorts of bad things could happen. So he said, well, what did you say that I could do? She said, well, it's in the middle of the month of Tammuz. We're coming into it now. Make it rain. Well, it's hard enough in our land to make it rain in the middle of Kislev, let alone in the middle of Tammuz, right? And we find in the Tanakh that Shmuel Hanavi counted it as one of the great miracles when he told the Jewish people that they were going to have a king and that he was no longer going to lead them, etc. And one of the things that he did to impress them was he made it rain. He said, Alok tzir, chiti mayom, it's the harvest time of the wheat here in the summer, and you'll see we'll have a rainstorm. And that was considered a miracle. So she said, so you got to make it rain. So Rovah prayed and it rained. So everyone was properly impressed. That night, the Talmud tells us, you know, as only the Talmud can tell these stories, that night Rovah's mother appeared to him, and she said, in heaven they say you're a nudnik. You keep on bothering them. Why do you bother them? They have to make it rain for you in the middle of Tammuz. They have nothing else to do up here. You have to promise me you'll stop that. And from then on, Rovah no longer proclaimed himself to be a miracle man. He no longer attempted to enlist the aid of heaven. I mean, that's a typical Talmudic story, though, you know, because the whole thing is captured in this anecdote. Rovah, because of his wealth and his connections with the government, was able to do wonderful things for the Jews. He was able to have favorable decrees. He was able to have an influence. He was able to ameliorate any problems that the Jews had. And this really is the golden period of the Jews who lived in Babylonia, because at this point in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the land of Israel, as far as Jewish life is concerned, closes down. The Byzantine Christians begin to appear. They're out to destroy the Jewish people, literally to destroy the Jewish people, commit genocide. If it would not have been for the Muslims who came in the beginning of the 7th century, they probably would have, at least they thought they would have been able to achieve their purpose. So the Lord sent them the Muslims to take care of them, and they're still working on it. And so Eretz Yisrael closes down. Now Abiy says the Talmidei Chachomim in Eretz Yisrael are greater than the Talmidei Chachomim in Bavel. He said, one of them is equal to two of us. But, he says, what can we do? There's no Eretz Yisrael anymore. The great Torah centers after Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish, and Tveria, the great Torah centers have been shut down, and there was a great emigration of Jews from the land of Israel, most of whom went to Bavel and came into the yeshivas in Bavel. And so therefore Bavel became central in all Jewish life, and it was the main center. It would remain the main center for the next 800 years. All the Torah came from Bavel, and all the Jewish leadership came from Bavel. And the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, became the Talmud, and not the Talmud that was written in Eretz Yisrael. And so therefore Abiy and Ravah, to a certain extent, represent the golden period. They also represent the golden period because by their time already, most of the Mishnah and most of the Breitot, all of the pieces of the Talmud were already in place. And therefore they summed it up. And in their discussions and their disagreements, and whatever they brought to the fore, that's the summation not only of Abiy and Ravah, but that's the summation of about 500 years worth of effort in the development of Torah Shabbal Peh. It would be another 200 years to really 300 years almost until the Talmud reached its final form. But after Abiy and Ravah, it is really just a job of fine-tuning, of assembling. The main structure is completed in the time of Abiy and Ravah. And that's why, it's another reason why the Talmud is called Havayas, the Abiy and Ravah, the discussions of Abiy and Ravah, because they are the ones who created the Talmud as we know it today. They're the ones that had that ability to do so. Abiy, the Talmud tells us that every Erev Shabbos he had a voice from heaven come to wish him Shabbat Shalom. Ravah only had it Erev Yom Kippur. So Ravah felt badly about it, that Abiy should have a heavenly greeting every week, and he only has it once a year. So in heaven they told him, listen, Abiy is not popular in this world, and you are. So it's enough for you. Your popularity in this world, that's enough for you. So if we come once a year to you, it's all right. Abiy is not popular. The halacha is not like Abiy. People say that they don't understand Abiy is sheer. Abiy is a poor person. Abiy, we got to come every week to give him a Shabbat Shalom. Your people here like you. It's all right. So you can stay. It's not a problem. Ravah was very popular in Machoza. The Gemara tells us an interesting story. There were many, many Gerim that lived in Machoza. There are many non-Jews that converted to Judaism in Machoza. For whatever reason, the Gemara doesn't explain what the reason was. And at that time there was a halachic discussion about whether a ger can marry the daughter of a Kohen. So a great rabbi came to town, and he's speaking to an audience. Apparently he was unaware that there were a lot of gerim in the audience. And he said, a ger is osir b'kahanis. A ger is not allowed to marry a kahanis. He said the ger should marry a mamzeres, which is a halacha in Kedushin. A ger is allowed to marry a mamzeres. So he said the drosha on Sukkos. So the Gemara says they all stood up and they threw their esrogim at him. Wanted to stone him with their esrogim. The price of esrogim must have been more reasonable then. So Ravah said to him, how do you say such a speech here? This is not the place to say the speech. So Ravah got up and he said, the halacha is that a ger is mutter to marry a kahanis. And the halacha is that a ger is mutter to marry a mamzeres too. He said, you pick which one you want to marry. Whichever one you want to marry is okay. So all the gerim applauded Ravah. So Ravah was very popular in town. And many Meforshim say that's the reason that the ger that died left him a lot of money, is because of the fact that he promoted gerim. But it's not that Ravah did it for popularity. Ravah held the halacha was like that. The only thing is, Ravah was a very astute person in knowing what audience he was addressing. He saw what happened with Rav Yosef and Rabbah when they addressed the audience in Pumbedisa and constantly gave them musar and musar and musar, to the extent that at the funeral they were not sad that he died, Rabbah. So he realized that that's not necessarily the way you're going to win friends and influence people. If you keep on pounding on them, that's not going to happen. And therefore he did it differently. And Ravah was well known and very, very popular in the community. He always tried to ameliorate problems, tried to help people. He was a public person. And that's what it meant that he went outside and pointed to the sky, right? He was an outside person. And in his creation of Mechoza, he transformed Mechoza into a famous city of Torah, a city that previously was known as a city of Gehenna. Ravah said, Ravah is a staunch, the thing that bothers Ravah the most, and Abiy also, you see it, is the lack of respect for Talmidei Chachamim that the Jewish people have. So lest you think that our problems are now, right? It's all, we are always struggling with the same idea of Kovod HaTorah. So Ravah said, Hane imshe tapshoi, these foolish people, that when they take out the Sefer Torah, everybody runs to kiss it. They stand up in front of the Sefer Torah is holy. And a Talmid Chacham who is a living Sefer Torah, they don't get up for him. They're not interested in him. So he said, foolish people. And Ravah also said that he never understood the people of Mechoza, he said, because twice a year the Yarchei Kala was in Mechoza. Now the Yarchei Kala was in the month of Ador and the month of Elul. And there the Talmidei Chachamim gathered from all over the Middle East to hear shiurim in the yeshiva in Pumbedisa and in Mechoza for a month's study. And they left their families, they left their businesses, and tens of thousands of people came to the Yarchei Kala. The Gemara says that when they stood up from the shir, the dust from the feet, you made a pillar of cloud that you could see, a pillar of dust that you could see for miles. So he said twice a year they see the Kovod HaTorah. They see how people sacrifice themselves for Torah. How people are willing to give up everything to come for a month to learn Torah. And it doesn't have an effect on them. They remain the same. So he said he never understood that nature. Why people were unable to respond to having a proper Kovod HaTorah. Both Abiy and Ravah emphasized that over and over and over again. That respect for Talmidei Chachamim. Abiy said that in his town they always said to him, what good are the rabbis? You know, they never make anything mutter. They never allow us anything, so what good are they? Maya Hanalei Rabbonon, what good are they? They never said a raven is kosher, right? They have the Supreme Court, then they could say things. What a... It's the creation here of another society, literally another society. There'll be a Jewish society, a Torah society, and there'll be the others will eventually disappear. All of Jewish history shows us that. Unable to maintain it. And the Navi says, Ochlei achazir v'arneves. But they don't get it. Maybe it's our fault that they don't get it. That also could be. But in any event, Rava is Rava and Abaye. So you say, what good are the rabbis? You know, the rabbis never make anything mutter. He said they don't understand the purpose of the rabbis. They don't understand Torah. They don't appreciate what they have, and therefore they don't know how to treat it. The difference between Rava and Abaye and previous generations is that previous generations, the study of Torah was to resolve halachot, was to resolve questions of halacha almost exclusively. Rava and Abaye, the reason they appear so many times is because they teach us the joy of study itself, of Torah itself. In Yiddish there was a phrase, redden and lernen, to talk and learning. You meet a Talmud Chacham, you talk and learning. It has no practical effect, and many times the thing that you're talking and learning with is about a subject that really has no relevance in our time. We'll talk about gifts to the priesthood, or we'll talk about the fact that sacrifices in the temple. Well, none of that has a relevance today. And yet, that's the joy of Torah. The joy of Torah is to be able to speak in learnings, to be able to talk to each other in Torah. That's Abaye and Rava. That's what they represent. They represent that greatness. Now, Abaye was a Kohen, as I mentioned. So Abaye, even though he was a poor person, Abaye said in Bovel the custom was that they still gave gifts, priestly gifts. The matnas kahuna, they still gave it to the Kohanim in the 3rd century. They were not that far removed from the destruction of the temple, and therefore they still had the custom of giving, let's say, portions of the animal that they slaughtered to the Kohen. They would give him gifts of grain and of fruit. So Abaye says, I never took anything. Because he said, when I studied in the Gemara, and I saw that those that took eventually pressured the people to give to them, bad things came out of it. The Gemara says that those that had chutzpah pushed to take, and the tznuim, those that were modest and humble, moshchim yadayim, they withdrew their hands. They didn't take anymore. So I didn't take either. He said, except once a year, Erev Yom Kippur, I had them bring to me matnas kahuna, the gifts of the kahuna, in order to prove that I'm a Kohen. So they shouldn't say he doesn't take the gifts of the kahuna because maybe he's not a real Kohen. Maybe there's a disqualification in his pedigree. So once a year, Abaye said I would take Erev Yom Kippur in order to show that I was a Kohen. When Abaye died, so then they made Rava the Rosh Yeshiva, but Rava didn't want to move to Pumbedisa. Rava already had his yeshiva established in Mechoza, so what happened was that the yeshiva moved to Mechoza. The yeshiva Pumbedisa moved to Mechoza, where it stayed for 14 years until Rava died. Rava died in his middle 70s, and when Rava died, then the yeshiva in Pumbedisa reopened, and under the Talmidim of Rava and Abaye, and it moved back. But Rava himself lived always in Mechoza, and the yeshiva itself moved to Mechoza with him. Rava, fascinating story that the Talmud tells, only the Talmud could tell this story. Rava was a son-in-law of Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda was a great Talmud Chacham, and Rav Chizda was a very, very wealthy man. So both, the Gemara tells us that Rav Chona and Rava were sitting by Rav Chizda and learning, and Rav Chizda had a young daughter, 3-4-year-old daughter, that was sitting on his lap while he was teaching the shir. And then, as a joke, Rav Chisda said to her, "You see these two Talmidei Chachomim, which one do you want to marry?" So she said, "I want both of them." And that's what happened. Rava said, when she said, "I want both of them," Rava said, "I'll be the second one." And what happened was that first she was married to the first one, and when he passed away, then Rava married her. And it is through her that Rava had children, and she's mentioned in the Gemara many, many times. She's a very, very famous woman. There are many famous Rebbitzins in the Talmud, and she's one of them. She was the daughter of Rav Chisda, and Rav Chisda was a very wealthy man, a powerful man. Rava was his son-in-law, and Rava benefited therefore because Rav Chisda already had all these contacts and already had all the government people that he knew, etc. So Rava just fit right in when he married her. And they had children together, and the Rava's children and grandchildren are mentioned many times in the Talmud. And again, undoubtedly a dynasty that still exists today, the descendants of Rava. But she said, "I'd marry both of them," right? And her words came true, that she did marry both of them. She was the wife of both of those Talmidim. Rava attempted to create a Jewish society that would be not only Torah-oriented, but would be protected by the local government. That the local government would give special recognition to the scholars, to the Talmidei Chachomim. Now this was something that, for instance, under the Romans, the scholars were all in hiding. It was dangerous to be a scholar. It was dangerous to be identified as being a student in the yeshiva, because the Romans felt that all of these people were potential traitors, that they were always working for Jewish independence, and that their opposition to paganism was so great that they would undermine the Roman rule in the Roman Empire. So the Talmidei Chachomim really went into hiding under Roman rule. Here in Bovel, however, not only did the Talmidei Chachomim not go into hiding, they demanded and received special privileges from the authorities. For instance, they were exempt from certain taxes that everybody else had to pay. They received the clergy discount on many things, but they were protected from having to do public service, because in all of these countries you had to do some sort of public service, if not the army, but you had to quarter people in your house. If the army came through the town, you had to provide your house that people should stay there, etc. Rava gained exemptions for all of these things for the Talmidei Chachamim. And that became a pattern throughout Jewish history. It's a pattern that remains today. That the Talmid Chacham somehow, by virtue of being a Talmid Chacham, is relieved from certain obligations which the rest of the citizenry is obligated to follow. Now, how that resonates in modern ears is a different question. But the tradition of it is many, many centuries old, and it was always part of Jewish life. Rava also, because of his relationship with the government, was able to see to it that the yeshivas were safeguarded from the non-Jews. People were afraid to start up with the yeshivas. People were afraid to start up with the students of the yeshivas because they knew that the heads of the yeshiva had good connections with the government, had good connections with the police. There would be all sorts of problems. As I mentioned, Rava was in the wine business and he was in the boat business. Now, Rava's wine business was very, very extensive. Jews that were in the wine business almost always had great connections in the non-Jewish community, because that's who they sold the wine to in the main part. The Talmud tells us that Rava was an expert in wine, and he was an expert in blending wine. So the Talmud tells us that once Rav Yosef, who was blind, Ravah came to him Erev Yom Kippur. Ravah came to ask his forgiveness on a matter that Ravah disagreed with him in halacha, and that Rav Yosef took exception to. He said, if you disagreed with me, then why did you come ask me? So he felt that Rav Yosef was hurt, so he came to ask his forgiveness on Erev Yom Kippur. But since Rav Yosef couldn't see, so Ravah didn't introduce himself right away, but Ravah mixed wine for him that he should drink with the Suda that we eat on Erev Yom Kippur. So he meant they drank wine as we drink water or soda. So he mixed wine for him and he gave him to drink. And Rav Yosef tasted the wine. He said, oh, Ravah's here. Because only Ravah knows how to mix wine that well. Only Ravah is able to produce such wine. So Ravah was famous in the entire community for many, many talents. We find that Ravah was an expert on all sorts of birds. Ravah went many times with the hunters to see different creatures. Ravah is a person on the outside that is looking always at the world and finds enjoyment in it. Nevertheless, the Talmud says that when Ravah studied Torah, sometimes he put his hands underneath his haunches when he was studying, and he didn't realize it, and he crushed his fingers till they bled. So great was his power of concentration in Torah that he didn't even realize the pain that he was causing himself where he had put his fingers, and that he bled from it. And Ravah also, as I mentioned, suffered from colitis, from stomach problems all of his life. But again, we don't see it in any of his words or in any reflection of his behavior. So we have here these two great people, Abiy and Ravah, who are really the culmination of the greatness of the Talmud, and who set the standard for all later generations, so that whenever we think of the Talmud, we always think of Abiy and Ravah. Their names resonate within us. They're live today. They exist every place a Jew studies the Talmud. And because of that, therefore, they, to a great extent, are the most beloved of all of the people of the Talmud, because we are most familiar with them. And that's why we have so many stories in the Talmud regarding them, because of the fact that they're like guests in our home. We all know them, we all appreciate them, we all deal with them, and therefore that's the greatness that they bring to the Talmud. I want to thank you all for attending this lecture series, and the Mir Tzashem will think of something else to do the next time.